44 years ago, right here in this hollow, the home of George and Mary Cunningham burned to the ground. Mary was inside. Their 3 children watched from those woods. The men who lit the fire wore badges, 22 of them.
Between November 14th and January 29th, 1979, 22 federal law enforcement officers died during systematic campaign by George Cunningham, who'd eliminated everyone responsible for fire that had killed his wife Sarah during raid on family property in Harlan County, Kentucky. Fire that had been started ostensibly as tactical measure for forcing occupants from house during standoff, but that had escalated when Agent Marcus Webb had deployed incendiary device causing structure to ignite, trapping Sarah inside, while 3 children had been forced to witness from yard where officers had restrained them. Death that had been characterized as accidental tragedy, resulting from tactical decisions gone wrong, when actually Sarah's fatal burning had been preventable through basic caution that proper procedures would have required exercising before employing fire as enforcement tactic. By February 2nd, all 22 agents and supervisors who'd participated in raid or who'd authorized using incendiary devices or who'd dismissed wrongful death complaint were dead, their bodies discovered throughout eastern Kentucky, where solitary actions by George Cunningham had systematically hunted and killed federal personnel through shotgun attacks, demonstrating that when governmental authority employs dangerous tactics, killing innocent women, and when systems refuse accountability for agents who burn civilians to death, then grieving husbands will deliver individual retribution that institutions declined to provide, even when evidence documented that Sarah's death had been preventable tragedy that negligence rather than necessity had caused. Harlan County, Kentucky occupied 470 square miles of mountainous Appalachian terrain in southeastern corner of state in 1979, populated by approximately 37,000 people working in declining coal mining operations and in limited agriculture. Economically depressed region where federal law enforcement operations targeting suspected criminal activity were conducted aggressively, creating tensions between governmental authority and mountain communities whose resistance to outside interference had historical precedent, making raids potentially dangerous when proper planning inadequately anticipated confrontational responses that aggressive tactics might provoke. The county's cultural landscape during late 1970s was characterized by strong family bonds and by protective attitudes toward women and children that any threats to families' safety were viewed as unforgivable violations requiring defense through whatever means necessary when systems failed protecting innocent lives. November 1979 meant late autumn in Kentucky mountains, where cooling weather was creating conditions for indoor family activities, including preparing for approaching Thanksgiving holiday. Month also marked period when Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms was conducting intensive operations throughout Appalachian regions, investigating suspected illegal firearms trafficking, creating situation where aggressive raid tactics were being employed without adequate concern for civilian safety, particularly regarding women and children, whose presence on targeted properties enforcement procedures inadequately protected or accommodated. The specific emphasis on rapid overwhelming force during this period reflected institutional priorities, emphasizing arrests and seizures over careful planning that proper implementation would have conducted, verifying whether families were present before initiating operations where dangerous tactics might endanger innocents. George Cunningham was coal miner age 36, whose wife Sarah, age 34, had been raising their 3 children, daughter Emma, age 12, son Thomas, age 9, daughter Mary, age 6, on family's modest property, while George had worked mine shifts providing income that subsistence living required supplementing through garden farming. Sarah Cunningham had been devoted mother, whose primary focus had been ensuring children's well-being and whose community involvement through church activities had made her respected figure throughout area. Woman whose sudden death during federal raid would devastate family and would create widespread outrage when circumstances suggested that basic caution would have prevented tragedy that aggressive enforcement had caused. ATF raid on Cunningham property had occurred November 13, 1979, when 18 federal agents had arrived with warrant alleging that George was involved in illegal firearms sales. Raid authorized based on informant's report that hadn't been adequately verified, but that enforcement priorities had made sufficient basis for conducting operation that would find no illegal weapons, but that aggressive tactics had employed creating dangerous situation where fire deployment had killed innocent woman, whose presence proper reconnaissance would have identified requiring modified approach protecting civilians. Agents' arrival at property had occurred during afternoon, when George had been at work leaving Sarah alone with 3 children, situation that proper planning would have anticipated requiring either delaying raid until male occupant was present or employing non-confrontational approach that woman with young children's presence demanded respecting. Sarah's refusal to permit agents to enter house without warrant that properly identified residents had created standoff when officers had demanded immediate access and Sarah had insisted on verifying documentation before allowing entry. Reasonable caution. That woman alone with young children should have been permitted exercising when actually agents had interpreted reluctance as suspicious behavior, justifying aggressive response rather than as legitimate concern that mother protecting children would naturally express. Standoff had lasted approximately 40 minutes, during which agents had positioned themselves surrounding house and had made increasingly threatening demands that Sarah exit with children, escalation that had frightened youngsters whose crying Sarah had been attempting to calm while explaining to officers that husband would be home from work soon and could address whatever concerns motivated raid. Agent Marcus Webb's decision to deploy incendiary device had been characterized as tactical measure, intended to force occupants from house through creating smoke that would make remaining inside untenable, employment of fire as enforcement tactic that proper procedures should have prohibited when women and children were known to be present, creating obvious dangers that deployment demonstrated either gross negligence or deliberate disregard for civilian safety. Incendiary devices' ignition had caused wooden structure to catch fire more rapidly than tactical planning had anticipated. Flames spreading throughout house within minutes, creating situation where Sarah's attempts to evacuate children had been hampered by smoke and by spreading fire that multiple escape routes had been blocked, creating fatal trap. 3 children's evacuation had occurred when Emma had managed to lead Thomas and Mary through front door escaping flames, emergence that agents had immediately intercepted, restraining children in yard, preventing them from attempting to return for mother, whose screams from inside burning house had created traumatic scene that youngsters witnessing would create permanent psychological damage. Sarah's death had occurred when structural collapse had prevented her escape. Woman who'd been attempting to follow children through front door had been trapped when ceiling had fallen blocking exit. Death, that medical examiner would determine, had resulted from smoke inhalation, rather than from burning, though distinction provided no comfort when preventable tragedy had killed devoted mother, whose only action had been protecting children during raid, that no illegal activity would justify conducting with tactics endangering innocence. George's arrival home from mine work had occurred during final moments of fire. Husband and father who'd seen smoke from distance and who'd rushed to property discovering house engulfed in flames and children sobbing in agent's custody and wife dead inside structure that fire had destroyed, seen that paternal and spousal love had experienced as total devastation, creating immediate understanding that everything that mattered had been destroyed through enforcement operation, that basic caution would have prevented from employing dangerous tactics. Children's traumatic accounts describing watching house burn while hearing mother's screams had created for George understanding that tragedy hadn't been quick accident, but had been prolonged horror, that youngsters had been forced witnessing creating damage that no amount of time would fully heal. Agent's departure after fire had been extinguished, leaving George with 3 traumatized children and with wife's burned remains and with destroyed home had occurred without apologies or without acknowledgements that tactics had been inappropriate. Bureaucratic processing that had treated Sarah's death as unfortunate incident rather than as preventable homicide that negligence had caused, requiring addressing through prosecution and through compensation. George's immediate attempts to comfort children while processing own grief had been complicated by Emma's, Thomas's, and Mary's repeated questions about why agents had started fire and why mother couldn't escape and whether officers would face consequences for killing woman who'd been protecting them, questions that devastated father had struggled answering honestly when actually no satisfactory explanations existed for tragedy that proper procedures would have prevented. George's formal complaint, filed with ATF on November 14th, had described Sarah's death as unjustified killing, resulting from employing fire as tactical measure when women and children were known to be present. Had explained that wife had been devoted mother, whose reasonable caution about permitting entry shouldn't have been interpreted as justifying deployment of incendiary device endangering family, had requested that Webb be prosecuted for manslaughter and that federal government compensate for Sarah's death and for children's trauma and for destroyed home. ATF Supervisor David Mitchell had dismissed complaint explaining that agents had authority to employ tactical measures when occupants refused compliance during enforcement operations, and that Sarah's death, while tragic, had been unintended consequence of legitimate tactics rather than being negligent homicide that prosecution would require proving, characterization that ignored witness accounts, and that treated woman's burning as acceptable cost of aggressive enforcement. Investigation into Webb's enforcement tactics revealed that Sarah's death wasn't isolated incident but represented pattern where agent had employed dangerous methods during raids without adequate concern for civilian safety. That at least 2 other operations had resulted in injuries to innocent people, though none fatally. Pattern demonstrating that reckless approaches, rather than careful planning, had characterized Webb's tactics, creating dangers that proper supervision should have corrected before mother's death had resulted from institutional failures, allowing aggressive agent to continue conducting operations where innocents were endangered. Documentation revealed that Webb had specifically advocated for using fire as tactical measure during training sessions, arguing that smoke would force compliance when verbal commands failed, philosophy that proper oversight should have rejected as creating unacceptable risks that Sarah's death had demonstrated as fatal consequences. George Cunningham's decision to systematically eliminate 22 federal law enforcement officers who'd participated in Sarah's killing was individual determination made during solitary vigil at wife's grave on November 14th evening. Same day ATF had dismissed complaint. Decision represented familial defense, framed within understanding that protecting women and children was fundamental obligation and that failing to hold accountable agents who killed innocent mothers was unforgivable institutional failure, that proper justice demanded correcting through eliminating everyone whose participation in raid or whose dismissal of complaint had enabled tragedy that spousal and paternal love required avenging. Planning involved identifying who'd participated in deploying fire or in authorizing tactics, determining where agents could be isolated, allowing shotgun attacks from close range, preparing Remington Model 870 pump-action shotgun that coal mining had taught George using for protection, and that buckshot loads would make devastatingly effective for conducting systematic campaign that determination would enable executing. Method of close-range shotgun attacks had been chosen because George possessed familiarity with firearm through Appalachian living, where weapons were common for hunting and protection, because buckshot at close range would ensure lethality, making confrontations decisive, because employing direct approach would send message that killing innocent woman had created enemy willing to face agents personally, rather than attacking from distance, suggesting cowardice, exceptional courage that facing armed federal officers required demonstrating when avenging wife's death demanded confrontational violence that fear couldn't prevent executing. Planning involved surveillance determining officers' routines, establishing locations where attacks could occur without interference, preparing to conduct campaign across weeks, creating terror throughout law enforcement when pattern would become clear that widowed father was systematically eliminating everyone connected to Sarah's burning. The systematic elimination began November 14th evening, just hours after complaint dismissal, when Agent Marcus Webb, who deployed incendiary device, was found dead at his residence, killed through close-range shotgun blast that investigation would determine had been execution-style killing, demonstrating that perpetrator had approached target directly rather than attacking from concealment. Death that had occurred same day, George had filed complaint demonstrating immediate retaliation rather than delayed response. Webb's death created alarm throughout federal law enforcement when shotgun execution suggested personal vendetta rather than random violence. Realization that would become clear as additional deaths occurred, following same pattern indicating that Sarah's widower was employing rural weapons skills for delivering vengeance that spousal grief had motivated. 7 agents who'd participated in November 13th raid died November 16th through 28th from similar close-range shotgun attacks while alone at vehicles or while entering homes. Killings that confirmed pattern when investigation recognized that all victims had been present during operation where Sarah had been killed and that perpetrator was targeting specific individuals rather than attacking random officers. Pattern continued throughout December and January, with agents and supervisors dying through shotgun attacks that ballistics analysis determined came from same Remington 870, victims found with devastating buckshot wounds that close range had made instantly fatal, demonstrating that attacks were being executed with determination that coal mining's dangers had developed, making widower formidable adversary whose courage law enforcement had catastrophically underestimated when assuming that grieving father wouldn't dare confronting armed federal agents. Most disturbing aspect of campaign was targeting of ATF supervisors who'd authorized using incendiary devices or who'd dismissed wrongful death complaint. 9 officials, including 4 regional supervisors, dying between December 20th and January 15th, who investigation would discover had been involved in approving tactical plans that fire deployment had included or had been responsible for dismissing George's complaint about Sarah's death. Targeting demonstrating that widower was eliminating not just agents who directly participated in burning, but was punishing everyone whose administrative decisions had enabled tactics killing innocent women or whose refusal to prosecute had denied justice that spousal love required obtaining. Deaths of high-ranking officials created panic throughout ATF when it became clear that grieving father was systematically eliminating anyone connected to wife's death, regardless of whether targets were field agents or were supervisors whose bureaucratic roles had facilitated tragedy. By January 29th, 22 agents and supervisors were dead from systematic campaign that had proceeded despite massive investigation involving FBI, ATF, and Kentucky law enforcement, deploying hundreds of personnel attempting to identify perpetrator and to prevent additional killings. Elimination of everyone who'd participated in or who'd authorized raid within 11 weeks demonstrated capability and determination that authorities hadn't anticipated from coal miner whose wife's death had seemed to render him devastated rather than dangerous. Investigation had focused immediately on George given obvious motive following Sarah's burning, and given that shotgun attacks' directness suggested someone willing to confront armed officers, but establishing direct evidence linking him to killings proved difficult when attacks had occurred without witnesses beyond victims, and when George maintained he'd been caring for traumatized children during times when murders occurred. Breakthrough came when FBI surveillance observed George positioning himself near residence of ATF supervisor. Surveillance team intervened before attack could occur, discovering George carrying Remington Model 870, loaded with buckshot and wearing work clothes, arrest that prevented additional death, and that provided opportunity for interrogation producing confession when George acknowledged that systematic campaign had been motivated by avenging Sarah's death and by punishing everyone whose participation in raid or whose dismissal of complaint had enabled tragedy that spousal and paternal obligations required defending against through eliminating agents who'd killed innocent women protecting children. Written confession detailed 22 killings with matter-of-fact descriptions, emphasizing that each victim had deserved death for participating in Sarah's burning, or for authorizing fire deployment, or for dismissing wrongful death complaint rather than prosecuting agents whose negligence had killed devoted mother. That campaign had been understood as familial duty rather than as revenge when protecting women and children was fundamental obligation that institutions had failed performing, creating necessity for individual action. Confession emphasized that Sarah had been innocent woman attempting to protect 3 young children when agents had deployed incendiary device causing fire that had killed wife and had traumatized youngsters, forcing them to witness mother's death. That tragedy had been preventable through basic caution that proper procedures would have required exercising before employing fire as enforcement tactic. Most remarkable aspect of confession was familial framework George had employed justifying violence, written account explaining that losing Sarah had destroyed children's mother, and had eliminated partner, whose companionship 18 years of marriage had established, creating bonds that death couldn't dissolve. That watching 3 traumatized youngsters struggle with nightmares and with grief while knowing that agents who'd caused suffering wouldn't face prosecution, had been experiencing institutional indifference, that proper accountability would have corrected through criminal charges, rather than through dismissing complaint-protecting perpetrators. Confession explained that being dismissed as just grieving widower had made systematic campaign possible when agents hadn't anticipated that coal miner would be capable of conducting coordinated violence, underestimation that determination had exploited for delivering retribution that institutions had declined providing. Trial for 22 murders occurred in April 1980 at Federal Courthouse in Lexington, where George Cunningham faced prosecution for killing law enforcement officers and civilian supervisors, case that attracted national media attention, both because shotgun attacks demonstrated widowers' courage in confronting armed agents, and because defense's emphasis on Sarah's wrongful death as provocation raised questions about whether killing innocent women through employing fire during raid had created grievances that might partially excuse systematic violence. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including George's detailed confession, Remington Model 870 recovered when arrested, ballistics analysis proving shotgun had fired buckshot killing all victims, systematic pattern demonstrating premeditation rather than spontaneous violence that immediate grief might have provoked. Defense didn't dispute that George had participated in planning and executing systematic shotgun campaign, but argued that actions had been desperate response to profound tragedy that Sarah's death represented when innocent woman had been killed through agents deploying incendiary device, while 3 young children had been forced to witness mother burning, creating trauma that no amount of counseling would fully heal. That ATF's dismissal of wrongful death complaint had left grieving widower without legal remedies for obtaining justice when systems had refused prosecuting agents whose negligence had killed devoted mother. Defense presented testimony from fire safety experts and from law enforcement reform advocates, explaining that raid tactics in 1979 inadequately protected civilians whose presence on targeted properties enforcement procedures should have accommodated, that Sarah's death had been preventable tragedy that proper planning would have avoided, through verifying family composition before conducting operation where fire deployment might endanger innocence. Most dramatic defense evidence came from testimony describing Sarah's character and children's trauma. Witnesses explaining that wife had been devoted mother, whose community involvement through church activities had made her beloved throughout area, that 3 youngsters had been permanently damaged through witnessing mother's death, creating nightmares and behavioral problems that years of therapy would be required addressing. Emma Cunningham's testimony at age 12, describing hearing mother's screams from inside burning house, while agents had restrained her, preventing attempts to help, had created emotional courtroom scene that emphasized human cost that aggressive enforcement had imposed on innocent family. Girl's account of watching home burn while knowing mother was trapped inside had demonstrated that tragedy's impact extended far beyond Sarah's death when children's psychological damage represented additional consequences that fire deployment had caused. But prosecution emphasized that regardless of Sarah's death being tragic and regardless of ATF's failure to prosecute agents, systematic assassination of 22 federal personnel through close-range shotgun attacks constituted murder that criminal law prohibited and that couldn't be justified through claiming familial vengeance or through arguing that wrongful death of wife excused coordinated violence against everyone connected to raid. Prosecutors noted that victims had included 9 supervisors whose participation had been administrative rather than involving direct fire deployment, that killing 22 people for one woman's death represented excessive response even when acknowledging that Sarah had been innocent and that death had been preventable through proper procedures. Jury deliberated 19 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 22 murder counts. Long jury deliberation reflected extraordinary complexity evaluating coal miner whose spousal grief had motivated violence that wife's wrongful death had provoked. deliberations that required assessing whether each killing had been proven beyond reasonable doubt, while also grappling with questions about whether Sarah's burning had created provocations that might partially excuse systematic campaign. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been profoundly sympathetic to George's loss and had been disturbed by children's trauma testimony and by evidence that Sarah's death had been preventable, but that shotgun attack's systematic nature and inclusion of supervisory targets had made convictions necessary when overwhelming evidence proved deliberate murders rather than spontaneous violence that immediate grief might have provoked. Judge sentenced George to life imprisonment without parole on multiple counts to be served consecutively. Effective life sentence acknowledging severity of killing 22 people, while noting that wife's wrongful death and ATF's dismissal of complaint created mitigation that death penalty consideration had rejected. Sentencing created controversies when family safety advocates argued punishment was excessive, given Sarah's preventable death, while law enforcement organizations maintained that systematic murder of officers and supervisors deserved unqualified condemnation, regardless of whether spousal grief had motivated violence. George Cunningham died in federal prison in 2021 at age 78 from natural causes, having served 41 years, had maintained throughout imprisonment that Sarah's death had justified eliminating everyone involved, that protecting families was fundamental obligation, that institutions had failed performing when refusing to prosecute agents who killed innocent women through employing fire-endangering children. George had refused requests for clemency, explaining that acknowledging wrongdoing would dishonor Sarah's memory and would suggest that wife's death had been acceptable when actually defending family's honor had required employing violence that spousal love demanded. Solitary prisoner, whose reputation as devoted husband and father had made him respected figure among inmates who viewed him as man who defended wife's memory against governmental indifference. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought renewed attention to Cunningham case when investigative journalist Patricia Morrison obtained ATF files and raid authorization documents. Research revealed that Webb had systematically employed dangerous tactics during operations and that supervisors had known about pattern but had tolerated methods because aggressive enforcement was valued for producing arrests even when such approaches endangered civilians, including women and children whose safety proper procedures should have prioritized. Morrison published findings in 2023 book titled Kentucky Wraith: How Woman's Burning Created Widower's Vengeance, comprehensive examination documenting raid procedures, tactical decisions, familial grief, systematic shotgun campaign, trial and imprisonment. Most shocking discovery was documentation proving that ATF officials had known that using incendiary devices near residential structures occupied by families created unacceptable risks but had authorized such tactics anyway, because enforcement priorities emphasized rapid resolution of standoffs regardless of civilian safety concerns. That internal communications had minimized dangers that fire deployment posed, suggesting that institutional culture viewed aggressive tactics as more important than protecting innocent lives that enforcement procedures inadequately considered. Correspondence revealed that some supervisors had actually encouraged using fire as tactical measure when occupants refused immediate compliance, creating culture where endangering civilians was acceptable cost of demonstrating federal authority that proper priorities would have rejected through requiring verification that women and children weren't present before employing dangerous methods. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2024, film titled When Mothers Burn, George Cunningham's Familial Justice, featuring interviews with fire safety experts, law enforcement reform advocates, Morrison discussing research findings, descendants of Cunningham family expressing perspectives about whether systematic shotgun campaign had been justified response to Sarah's wrongful death. Documentary presented balanced account, acknowledging both profound tragedy that killing innocent woman represented and 22 deaths affecting families regardless of deceased individuals' degrees of culpability for Sarah's burning or for authorizing tactics. Most powerful documentary segment featured interview with Emma Cunningham, age 57 in 2024. George's daughter, who'd been 12 years old during raid and who'd witnessed mother's death. Emma explained that watching agents start fire that killed our mother while forcing us to stand in yard unable to help destroyed our childhood in ways that never fully healed. Hearing Mum's screams from inside burning house created nightmares that decades later still wake me. Understanding that agents used fire as tactic, without caring that women and children were inside, felt like our lives were worthless compared to demonstrating federal power. ATF, dismissing Dad's complaint rather than prosecuting Webb, communicated that Mum's death was acceptable price for aggressive enforcement. Dad believed defending Mum's memory required punishing everyone whose participation in raid or whose refusal to prosecute had enabled tragedy that proper procedures would have prevented. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from interviews with families of some 22 killed individuals. Interviews revealed complex perspectives, ranging from those who maintained relatives had been murder victims, whose shotgun deaths deserved unqualified condemnation, to those who acknowledged deceased family members had participated in or had authorized tactics where woman's preventable death had resulted from institutional failures. Several families described how learning details about Sarah's innocence and about Webb's pattern of dangerous tactics had changed understanding of case. Explained that initial characterization of relatives as victims of unprovoked violence had evolved into recognition that systemic problems had created environment where civilian safety was inadequately prioritized, creating tragedy that desperate spousal response had made explosive. Federal government conducted review in 2022, examining law enforcement tactical decisions regarding fire deployment. Review identified patterns where aggressive methods had inadequately protected civilians, whose presence on targeted properties enforcement operations should have anticipated and accommodated, that incendiary devices posed unacceptable risks when families might be present requiring strict limitations, preventing situations where women and children could be endangered, that complaint processes inadequately addressed wrongful deaths, making families feel that obtaining justice required extra legal responses. Review concluded that reforms were necessary for preventing incidents where tactical decisions endangered innocence and where systems' failures to prosecute created profound grievances that evidence suggested could motivate violence when widowers experienced institutional indifference to wives' deaths. Federal legislation passed in 2023 established Sarah Cunningham Civilian Safety during Tactical Operations Act, requiring federal and state law enforcement agencies to implement strict protocols protecting families during raids, prohibiting use of incendiary devices when women or children might be present, requiring that reconnaissance verify family composition before conducting operations, where dangerous tactics might be employed, establishing presumptions against using fire as tactical measure, creating independent review for complaints about civilian deaths during enforcement, mandating prosecution when evidence suggests negligent homicide rather than justified tactical decision. Legislation was named for Sarah, recognizing that her death had exposed institutional failures requiring reforms, that preventing similar tragedies required federal standards ensuring that families' safety was prioritized over aggressive enforcement tactics, that proper procedures would accommodate through verifying civilian presence and through establishing safeguards preventing agents from employing fire endangering innocents. Historical marker installed at location where Cunningham home had stood before fire, destroyed structure, reflected balanced approach. George Cunningham, 1979, systematically killed 22 federal law enforcement officers and supervisors following wrongful death of his wife Sarah during ATF raid at this location. Agent Marcus Webb deployed incendiary device causing fire that killed Sarah, while 3 children, Emma, Thomas and Mary, were forced to witness from yard where agents restrained them. Fire was employed as tactical measure intended to force compliance. Sarah's death was preventable tragedy. ATF dismissed wrongful death complaint. George conducted shotgun campaign using coal miners' determination. Convicted after 19-day jury deliberation. Served 41 years until death. Case prompted federal reforms including Sarah Cunningham Civilian Safety Act. This site reminds us that families deserve protection during raids, that fire poses unacceptable risks, that spousal love demands defending innocent wives' memories. By 2024, Cunningham case remained most studied example, examining intersection of spousal grief and law enforcement accountability following civilian deaths during tactical operations. Case studied in training about protecting families and about understanding that wrongful deaths of innocent women create profound grievances requiring institutional responses that prosecution and compensation should provide rather than forcing desperate individual actions. Modern family safety and law enforcement reform movements invoke George Cunningham as symbol of spousal devotion defending wife's memory, argue that systematic shotgun campaign, while legally unjustifiable, represented desperate assertion that innocent women's lives matter and that agents who kill mothers through negligence must face consequences when systems refuse prosecuting preventable tragedies. Comparative analysis examining Cunningham's 22 victims revealed complex picture, where Agent Webb had deployed incendiary device and had characterized fire as tactical measure, making him primary target, whose death no one disputed was intentional focus of campaign. 7 agents who'd participated in November 13th raid had been present when Sarah was killed, creating responsibility that shotgun attacks had treated as warranting death. 9 supervisors who'd authorized tactical plans including fire deployment or who'd dismissed wrongful death complaint had made administrative decisions enabling tragedy. 5 remaining victims had been regional officials whose involvement had been peripheral without directly authorizing operation, but whose supervisory roles in enforcement program had made them targets when George's campaign had expanded beyond immediate perpetrators to include broader institutional apparatus that civilian safety inadequately prioritized. This distribution raised questions about whether killing 5 peripheral officials and 9 supervisors represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that Sarah's death had been preventable and that institutional dismissal of complaint had denied justice. Modern scholarship examining Cunningham case within broader context of law enforcement tactical procedures has revealed that Sarah's death represented pattern during 1970s, 1980s, when aggressive methods emphasizing rapid, overwhelming force inadequately protected civilians, including women and children, whose presence on targeted properties enforcement operations should have anticipated and accommodated through reconnaissance and through tactical protocols requiring verification before employing dangerous measures. Comprehensive analyses examining this period have documented dozens of incidents where families had been endangered or injured during raids, that officials had prioritized enforcement objectives over safety considerations, creating accumulated grievances that occasionally exploded into violence when specific tragedies represented violations that spouses couldn't accept without demanding accountability that institutional systems refused providing. What distinguished Cunningham case from other raid fatality conflicts was combination of victim being innocent woman attempting to protect young children rather than being adult male suspect, Sarah being killed through fire deployment that 3 children had been forced witnessing, creating trauma extending beyond immediate death, George being widowed coal miner whose courage in confronting armed federal officers demonstrated exceptional determination that close-range shotgun attacks required possessing, systematic campaign being motivated by both spousal grief and paternal responsibility for defending children's mother's memory. Life imprisonment spanning 41 years, making case among longest sentences served before death in custody for familial defense violence. Trial featuring daughter Emma's testimony describing witnessing mother's death, raising unprecedented questions about whether preventable tragedy killing innocent woman could ever partially excuse systematic murder that spousal love had motivated. Federal legislation being named for female victim rather than for perpetrator, recognizing that reform's purpose was preventing tragedies like Sarah's death rather than merely responding to violence that grief had created. By 2024, 45 years after shotgun campaign and 3 years after George's death in prison, descendants of some 22 killed individuals had established dialogue with Cunningham family members, efforts that had been initiated by Jennifer Webb, age 48, whose grandfather, Agent Marcus Webb, had deployed incendiary device killing Sarah. Jennifer had contacted Cunningham family, explaining that understanding spousal grief's intensity and children's trauma was necessary for her family to achieve closure about grandfather's actions and about whether fire deployment had been justified tactical decision or had been negligent homicide that prosecution should have addressed. Dialogue had expanded to include other families on both sides, had resulted in joint memorial services where participants acknowledged complexity that simple narratives condemning systematic shotgun attacks or defending spousal vengeance couldn't adequately capture. Reconciliation efforts had been controversial within both communities. Some victims' families maintained that dialogue with family whose member had murdered relatives was inappropriate. Regardless of Sarah's death context, argued that focus should remain on 22 deaths rather than on woman's burning that had motivated coordinated violence. Similarly, some Cunningham family members opposed reconciliation, explaining that George had died in prison defending Sarah's memory and that acknowledging wrongdoing would dishonor both father's sacrifice and mother's innocence. That engagement with victims' families suggested acceptance of legal system's judgments, when actually they viewed imprisonment as unjust punishment for defending wife against institutional indifference. But participants in dialogue process emphasized that acknowledging all victims, including George, who died in prison, and Sarah, whose death had triggered tragedy, and 22 people whose deaths had affected families, was necessary for honest examination of how woman's wrongful death and institutional failures had combined, creating cascading violence affecting multiple generations. Jennifer Webb's reconciliation work had been motivated partly by discovering through Morrison's research that her grandfather had systematically employed dangerous tactics during operations, creating pattern that proper supervision should have corrected before Sarah's death had resulted. That fire deployment had been unnecessary tactical escalation when standoff could have been resolved through patience, waiting for George's return from work, allowing peaceful resolution that woman and children's safety would have required attempting. Revelation that had created questions about whether grandfather had been criminally negligent rather than being agent conducting justified tactical operation. Jennifer's conversations with Cunningham family members had revealed that Sarah's death, while triggering immediate violence, had occurred within context of broader institutional culture where civilian safety was inadequately prioritized and where complaints about wrongful deaths were routinely dismissed protecting agents rather than prosecuting negligence. That spousal grief had been compounded by systems' refusal to acknowledge that innocent woman's death represented tragedy requiring accountability rather than being acceptable cost of aggressive enforcement. This broader context had become important in reconciliation dialogues because it explained why George's violence had been so systematic and had included supervisory targets whose administrative decisions had enabled Sarah's death or had dismissed complaint. Helped participants understand that while shotgun campaign couldn't be legally justified, it had represented culmination of institutional failures affecting not just Cunningham family, but entire communities whose civilian members' enforcement operations endangered through inadequate safety procedures and through refusing to prosecute agents whose negligence killed innocents. Understanding that Sarah's death had been experienced not as isolated tragedy, but as demonstration that women's lives were less important than demonstrating federal authority, helped victims' families comprehend why spousal response had been so extreme. While understanding that 22 deaths had affected families regardless of whether deceased individuals had deployed fire or had merely authorized tactics, helped Cunningham descendants recognize that violence had created suffering exceeding what any woman's death could justify. Contemporary debates about Cunningham case reflected broader conflicts about limits of law enforcement tactics when operations endanger families, about whether wrongful death of innocent woman can ever justify coordinated violence, about how societies should balance enforcement objectives against protecting civilian lives. Annual memorial services organized by reconciliation participants attracted both supporters, who viewed dialogue as path toward healing, and critics who maintained that focus should remain on condemning shotgun attacks rather than on examining contexts that might appear to justify campaign that had killed 22 people for one woman's death, regardless of how profound spousal grief had been. The enduring questions that Cunningham case raises about appropriate protections for families during tactical operations, about whether wrongful death of innocent woman warrants violent response when legal remedies are unavailable, about how spousal grief can motivate extreme violence when institutional systems dismiss complaints, about whether systematic killing of supervisors whose administrative decisions enabled death creates accountability. These remain unresolved 45 years after Shotgun Campaign. Continue shaping debates about family safety protections, about preventing tactical procedures that endanger innocence, about limits of justifiable violence defending innocent wives' memories. Annual memorial gatherings demonstrate that time alone doesn't resolve fundamental disagreements about moral responsibility when institutions inadequately protect civilians and when grieving widowers respond through systematic violence, claiming spousal love required defending wives' innocence. That honest examination requires acknowledging both legitimate grievances about Sarah's preventable death and 22 deaths affecting families regardless of victims' degrees of participation in burning. Modern family safety advocacy movements invoke Cunningham case when advocating for stronger protections during law enforcement operations, argue that current laws inadequately prevent raids from endangering families or inadequately prosecute agents whose negligence kills innocent civilians. That Sarah Cunningham Civilian Safety Act, while important, represents minimum standards that should be expanded to include presumptions against conducting operations where families are present and to require automatic prosecution when evidence suggests negligent homicide rather than justified tactical decision. Critics counter that emphasizing family protections risks obscuring that 22 human deaths resulted from Sarah's burning, that focus should remain on preventing violence rather than on expanding restrictions that might constrain legitimate enforcement even when families might be present. Descendants of Cunningham family, including Emma, expressed nuanced perspectives about George's systematic violence. Emma acknowledged that killing 22 people had created victims whose families had suffered, regardless of whether deceased individuals had deployed fire or had authorized tactics, but emphasized that understanding actions required recognizing spousal context, where losing Sarah following 18 years of marriage had devastated George, leaving him without partner and leaving children without mother, whose protection proper enforcement should have prioritized. Emma's balanced position created some controversy within broader family safety advocacy community, where some argued that any acknowledgement of Shotgun Campaign's excessiveness risked betraying George's defense of Sarah's memory, while others maintained that honest examination required recognizing that violence had exceeded what any woman's death could justify when 9 supervisors and 5 peripheral officials had been killed. Federal legislation establishing family safety protections prompted examination of broader patterns where law enforcement operations had historically endangered civilians. Department of Justice analysis, examining approximately 800 incidents from 1960 to 2000 period where families had been present during raids, identified systematic patterns where aggressive tactics had inadequately anticipated or protected women and children whose presence proper reconnaissance would have identified, that incendiary devices and other dangerous measures had been employed without adequate consideration of civilian safety, that complaint processes had routinely dismissed wrongful death claims, protecting agents rather than prosecuting negligence when evidence suggested preventable tragedies. Analysis resulted in recommendations for comprehensive family safety training, for strict accountability when civilians are killed during operations, for independent review when spouses file wrongful death complaints, for requiring clear justification before any operation involving families can be authorized. Contemporary law enforcement training incorporating Cunningham case emphasizes that protecting families serves fundamental obligation and practical function preventing violence, that understanding spousal grief's intensity, when wives are killed through negligence, is necessary for recognizing that institutional dismissal of complaints creates profound grievances, requiring accountability through prosecution and compensation, rather than forcing desperate individual responses. That civilian deaths communicate institutional indifference, undermining law enforcement legitimacy, and creating resentments that entire communities might support when widowers interpret wrongful deaths as requiring retribution that spousal love demands. Training materials cite specific example of Sarah's burning, resulting in 22 deaths as demonstration that inadequate family protections create cascading harms affecting law enforcement communities throughout regions. Consequences that proper procedures and prosecution would have prevented. If officials had recognized that killing innocent women attempting to protect children represented preventable tragedy, requiring accountability rather than being acceptable, cost that aggressive enforcement excuse through claiming justified tactical decision. International law enforcement examining family safety protections frequently cite Cunningham case as example, demonstrating consequences when operations fail protecting civilians. Scholars note that women and children globally deserve special protections during enforcement operations, that verification requirements and tactical restrictions should provide preventing situations where innocent mothers become casualties that proper procedures would have avoided. Research examining family enforcement conflicts across multiple nations has revealed patterns where civilians' deaths have motivated violence. That Cunningham's shotgun campaign, while extreme in its systematic directness, exemplified broader phenomenon, where populations experience profound grief when institutional systems inadequately protect innocents, whose deaths create grievances that spousal love transforms into demands for accountability, that desperate measures deliver when official channels refuse providing justice. By 2024, the location where Cunningham home had stood before fire, destroyed structure had been designated as memorial site. Structure erected displaying photographs of Sarah showing devoted mother whose community involvement had made her beloved. Containing educational materials, explaining family safety importance during raids, and describing how proper procedures would have prevented tragedy through reconnaissance, verifying women and children were present before conducting operation where fire deployment might endanger them. Physical memorial included timeline showing events of November 13, 1979, demonstrating how standoff had escalated from Sarah's reasonable caution about permitting entry to agents' deployment of incendiary device that had killed innocent woman attempting to protect 3 young children. Memorial site included recorded testimony from fire safety experts explaining that incendiary devices near occupied residential structures created unacceptable risks that proper protocols should have prohibited when family's presence was known, that Sarah's death had been entirely preventable through either waiting for George's return from work, allowing peaceful resolution, or through employing non-confrontational approaches that woman with young children's safety demanded respecting. Recordings emphasized that forcing Sarah to choose between permitting immediate entry without proper verification or facing fire deployment had created impossible situation where mother attempting to protect children had been killed through tactics that basic humanity would have rejected as inappropriately endangering innocence. Memorial site's educational placards explained raid procedure problems in 1979, described how aggressive tactics emphasizing rapid, overwhelming force inadequately protected civilians whose presence proper reconnaissance would have identified, explained how fire deployment protocols inadequately required verification, creating situations where agents might endanger people performing ordinary defensive parenting that careful assessment would have recognized as legitimate rather than as suspicious behavior justifying escalation. Materials noted that Sarah's death had been preventable through basic patience, that requiring agents to wait for George's return from mine work would have allowed verifying warrant and addressing concerns without endangering family, that institutional culture valuing rapid resolution over civilian safety had created tragedy that proper priorities would have prevented. Memorial Site's section honoring Sarah emphasized her character as devoted mother, whose church involvement and community service had made her respected throughout area, displayed children's drawings from 1979 showing family before tragedy with Emma's, Thomas's, and Mary's depictions of mother demonstrating love, that death had eliminated creating permanent damage that decades of therapy had attempted addressing. Materials included Emma's adult reflection written in 2023 explaining that losing Mom when I was 12 destroyed our childhood security. Watching house burn while hearing her screams created trauma that 50 years later hasn't fully healed. Understanding that agents used fire without caring that women and children were inside made me realize that our families' lives were considered disposable compared to demonstrating federal power. Dad's systematic campaign, while legally wrong, represented spousal love demanding accountability. When systems refused prosecuting agents whose negligence killed innocent woman protecting her children. Memorial Site's complimentary exhibit honored 22 killed individuals, displayed photographs and biographical information about each victim, included statements from families describing losses and describing perspectives about whether relatives' deaths had been preventable, if family safety had been prioritized, or whether deaths represented consequences when enforcement operations systematically endangered innocents whose wrongful death systems refused prosecuting. Balanced presentation that refused simplifying story into narrative celebrating George's resistance or condemning shotgun violence, acknowledged complexity requiring visitors to grapple with competing values about family protection, about preventing negligent homicide, about limits of violence defending innocent wives' memories. The three Cunningham children's long-term outcomes demonstrated varying impacts that witnessing mother's death had created. Emma had struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder throughout adult life, requiring ongoing therapy and medication managing symptoms that November 13th trauma had created. Had married and had children, but had experienced difficulties trusting authority figures and had been involved in family safety advocacy work, channeling grief into preventing similar tragedies. Thomas had developed substance abuse problems during adolescence as coping mechanism for trauma, had experienced multiple incarcerations for drug-related offenses, had eventually achieved sobriety in his 30s, and had worked in addiction counseling, helping others whose childhood traumas had created similar struggles. His life trajectory demonstrating how witnessing violence could create cascading problems that intervention and support might have ameliorated if provided adequately. Mary had managed trauma through academic achievement, had earned doctorate in psychology specializing in childhood trauma, and had published extensively about long-term impacts that witnessing parental death during violence created for development, had maintained that Sarah's death had motivated understanding, how institutional failures created family tragedies, and how proper support could help survivors manage grief that prevention should have made unnecessary experiencing. Three siblings' different paths demonstrated that witnessing mother's death had affected each uniquely, but that common thread was permanent damage that November 13th had created, requiring lifelong management regardless of individual coping strategies that therapy and personal resilience had employed, for maintaining functionality despite trauma that proper procedures would have prevented. Inflicting. George's relationship with children during imprisonment had been characterized by regular correspondence and by occasional visits that prison policies had permitted, father whose letters had emphasized love for Emma, Thomas, and Mary and had explained that systematic campaign had been motivated by defending their mother's memory, rather than by abandoning parental responsibilities that incarceration had prevented fulfilling directly. Children's perspectives about father's violence had been mixed, with Emma viewing systematic campaign as understandable, if legally wrong response to institutional indifference. Thomas struggling with conflicting feelings about father, whose actions had been motivated by love, but whose imprisonment had created additional abandonment compounding mother's death. Mary analyzing violence through professional psychological lens, recognizing that trauma and grief had motivated actions that healthier coping mechanisms might have channeled differently if support systems had been available. The broader implications of Cunningham case extended beyond individual tragedy. When researchers examining ATF enforcement culture during 1970s-1980s discovered that Webb's pattern of employing dangerous tactics had represented systematic problem where agents were actively rewarded for aggressive approaches, that rapid resolutions created regardless of civilian casualties, that institutional priorities emphasized demonstrating federal authority through overwhelming force rather than through careful planning, that proper concern for innocent lives would have required prioritizing. Comprehensive studies examining this period revealed that federal raids had killed or injured approximately 60 civilians, including 12 women and 8 children during 1975-1985 period across Appalachian regions, that officials had characterized such casualties as acceptable costs of conducting operations, rather than as preventable tragedies that proper procedures would have avoided. That families who'd filed wrongful death complaints had been routinely dismissed through characterizing deaths as unintended consequences of legitimate tactics, even when evidence contradicted such claims, demonstrating that institutional culture systematically protected agents rather than holding accountable those whose negligence had killed innocents. Until next time, remember that George Cunningham systematically killed 22 federal law enforcement officers and supervisors after Agent Marcus Webb deployed incendiary device during ATF raid on family property, killing wife Sarah, who'd been attempting to protect 3 young children, Emma, Thomas and Mary, when agents had employed fire as tactical measure intended to force compliance during standoff. That Sarah's death had occurred when structure had ignited more rapidly than tactical planning anticipated, with flames spreading throughout house, creating fatal trap. That smoke inhalation and structural collapse had made unsurvivable. That 3 children had been forced to witness from yard, where agents had restrained them, preventing attempts to help, creating trauma that decades of therapy would be required addressing. That ATF dismissed George's wrongful death complaint, characterizing Sarah's burning as unintended consequence of legitimate tactics, despite fire deployment near occupied residential structure, with known family presence representing negligent decision that proper procedures should have prohibited. That George conducted shotgun campaign employing Remington Model 870 and coal miners' determination, confronting armed federal officers, directly eliminating everyone who'd participated in raid or who'd authorized fire deployment or who'd dismissed complaint. That 19-day jury deliberation examined whether preventable death of innocent woman attempting to protect children could partially excuse murders before convicting on all counts, making one of longest deliberations in Kentucky federal history. That George served 41 years until death, maintaining that defending Sarah's memory had been spousal obligation, requiring punishing agents when legal systems refused prosecuting negligence. That case prompted federal reforms establishing Sarah Cunningham Civilian Safety Act, requiring strict protocols protecting families during raids and prohibiting incendiary device use when women or children might be present, and mandating prosecution when negligent homicide evident. And that ultimately families deserve protection, recognizing women and children's special vulnerability. That wrongful deaths require accountability that prosecution must provide. That spousal grief creates profound obligations defending innocent wives' memories, when institutional systems dismiss complaints rather than acknowledging that preventable tragedies represent failures, requiring addressing through reforms and through justice rather than through protecting agents whose negligence killed devoted mothers, performing ordinary defensive parenting that basic humanity should have respected, rather than escalating through employing fire as tactical measure, endangering innocents whose safety proper enforcement would have prioritized above demonstrating federal authority through aggressive tactics that careful planning and patience would have made unnecessary when actually waiting for husband's return from mine work would have allowed peaceful resolution. Protecting family whose only action had been woman's reasonable caution about permitting entry without proper verification, that mother protecting young children naturally would express creating situation where institutional indifference to civilian safety had transformed routine enforcement into fatal tragedy. That decades later still affects survivors whose childhood trauma witnessing mother's death created, requiring ongoing management. Despite time's passage, demonstrating that violence's impacts extend far beyond immediate casualties when children forced to witness burning experience permanent psychological damage that proper procedures would have prevented, through recognizing that families' safety deserves prioritizing above aggressive enforcement objectives. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of family safety and systematic violence across 45 years, the discovery that Agent Webb had systematically employed dangerous tactics during operations creating pattern that proper supervision should have corrected before Sarah's death, the deployment of incendiary device near residential structure, occupied by woman and 3 young children, creating fire that had killed innocent mother, attempting to protect youngsters, while agents had restrained Emma, Thomas and Mary in yard, forcing them to witness burning, creating trauma that decades later still affects survivors, The ATF's dismissal of wrongful death complaint protecting Webb rather than prosecuting negligent homicide, communicating that Sarah's life was considered acceptable cost of aggressive enforcement, that civilian safety inadequately constrained. The systematic shotgun campaign where George employed Remington 870 and exceptional courage confronting armed federal officers, directly eliminating 22 people, including 7 raid participants and 9 supervisors whose administrative decisions had enabled tactics and 5 peripheral officials. The 19-day jury deliberation, examining whether innocent woman's preventable death attempting to protect children could excuse systematic murders, making one of longest deliberations in Kentucky federal history. The life imprisonment where George served 41 years until death, age 78. Maintaining that defending Sarah's memory was spousal obligation requiring accountability when legal systems refused prosecuting agents whose negligence killed devoted mother. The federal legislation establishing Sarah Cunningham Civilian Safety Act, named after female victim, requiring strict family protection protocols and prohibiting incendiary devices when women or children present and mandating prosecution when negligent homicide evident. The memorial site where Cunningham home stood before fire, showing Sarah's character as beloved community member and children's trauma testimony and balanced presentation honoring all victims. The 3 children's varied life trajectories, demonstrating long-term impacts that witnessing mother's death created requiring decades of therapy and creating challenges that prevention should have made unnecessary. The reconciliation efforts uniting descendants 45 years later, while debates continue about whether killing 9 supervisors and 5 peripheral officials represented excessive response. The impossible questions about whether preventable death of innocent woman attempting to protect children justified systematic murder, and whether spousal grief can ever excuse coordinated violence, regardless of how profound loss was. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how enforcement tactics endanger rather than protect, how innocent women's deaths in raids represent institutional failures, how children forced to witness violence experience permanent trauma. Comment about whether systematic shotgun attacks were proportional response to Sarah's preventable burning, or whether legal remedies should have been pursued despite agencies dismissing complaints. Whether 45 years provides adequate perspective for reconciliation when George died in prison defending honor. Whether memorial should emphasize improper tactics or acknowledge 22 deaths affecting families regardless of victims' participation in burning. Because these questions persist wherever enforcement operations target properties where families reside, wherever aggressive tactics prioritize rapid resolution over civilian safety, creating conditions where innocent women become casualties that proper procedures would prevent, wherever fire deployment near occupied structures endangers innocents whose presence reconnaissance should identify, requiring modified approaches protecting lives, wherever officials dismiss wrongful death complaints, protecting agents rather than prosecuting negligence, when evidence demonstrates preventable tragedies, wherever institutional culture values demonstrating federal authority through overwhelming force, above recognizing that families' safety deserves prioritizing creating accumulated grievances that occasionally explode into violence when specific incidents represent violations that spousal love cannot accept, requiring systematic responses, that coal mining's dangers develop courage enabling, and that profound grief motivates when alternatives mean accepting that governmental authority can kill innocent wives, attempting to protect children, while dismissing complaints that accountability should provide through prosecution rather than through characterizing deaths as unintended consequences of legitimate tactics. What George Cunningham's systematic shotgun campaign demonstrated most fundamentally about conflicts between family safety and law enforcement tactical decisions was that when enforcement operations designed ostensibly for addressing suspected criminal activity are conducted actually through aggressive methods prioritizing rapid resolution over civilian protection, when tactical measures employ fire deployment specifically to force compliance rather than employing patience and non-confrontational approaches that families' presence demands respecting, when governmental authority forces women attempting to protect young children to face impossible choices, between immediate compliance or facing dangerous escalation that basic humanity should reject. When institutional systems dismiss wrongful death complaints, protecting agents, rather than prosecuting negligence when evidence demonstrates preventable tragedies, when spousal grief and paternal responsibility for defending children's mother create obligations that legal remedies unavailability, makes addressing through violence that determination enables, when 3 young children are forced to witness mother burning, creating permanent trauma that decades of therapy cannot fully heal. Then grieving widowers possessing exceptional courage will employ shotgun attacks, confronting armed federal officers directly through systematic campaign, eliminating everyone whose participation in raid or whose administrative decisions enabling tactics or whose dismissal of complaints contributed to innocent woman's death, that proper procedures would have prevented through verifying family composition and through prohibiting fire deployment near occupied structures, and through employing patience allowing peaceful resolution that civilian safety demands, attempting, rather than escalating through dangerous measures, that aggressive enforcement prioritizes above protecting lives, that spousal love requires defending, even when legal consequences include life imprisonment, and even when children experience additional abandonment through father's incarceration, because alternatives mean accepting that institutional indifference can kill devoted mothers, performing ordinary defensive parenting without facing accountability, that prosecution should provide creating conditions where systematic responses become inevitable when widowed coal miners understand that defending wives' memories requires employing whatever violence spousal obligations demand for ensuring that agents who kill innocents face consequences that legal systems refuse delivering through dismissing complaints that proper justice would address through criminal charges rather than through characterizing deaths as acceptable costs, that aggressive enforcement excuses